and joined by four very distinguished and intelligent gentlemen, and they're going to need to be, because we're going to try and answer the question, why would you do business in Chicago? And that is, counterintuitive perhaps. But I want to start with John Cochrane, who you've got all the bios and the collateral here. All you need to know about John Cochrane is he's got a bachelor's degree from MIT. So there's his credential, there's his qualifier. But my question is, as you look at the Madisonian laboratories of democracy, and you see what's happening in Chicago and Illinois more generally, it's not just the last 10 years. It's not just the last 18 months since we passed a tax increase. In fact, Illinois has been 48th in the nation in job creation over the last 30 years. Only Michigan and Ohio have thrown off less jobs than Illinois. So I guess the question is, where do we start in terms of attacking the business climate or creating a business climate that is hospitable to business, since we seem to have been on a slow, steady decline for some time before some of the bad governors and bad policies of late, and it's only increased in pace in the last few years?
Well, let's see. Let's repeat what we just said all morning.
Yeah.
Hospitable to business. We need to be hospitable. There's this confusion between being pro-business and being pro-new business. You want to be hospitable to people who want to start business, not just to keep your cronies around with special tax breaks and win somebody back with some special deal. That's great for the politician, but that's not what kind of breeds this garden of growth, which is what we need. As I look at it, yeah, the taxes are high, but the taxes are chaotic. The regulatory impediments are a lot of the problems to getting those new businesses that ferment going. One good story was, this was just from the newspaper, my president, Zimmer, when Rahm Emanuel took over as mayor, one of the first things he did is he went to the university and said, what can we do to make things better? And Zimmer told this story of, we wanted to put in lights across the Midway so our students could cross, and it took us 2 years to get the permits. We wanted to put up a building in Beijing in order to have an outpost there. It took us 1 year from having the idea to opening the door. So much easier to do business in an evil communist dictatorship than in the city of Chicago. Well, I think they heard that, but there's all this sand in the gears of getting the alderman's approval and the various regulatory things going. I think that's the problem. Illinois has the ingredients, so I'll say make one more point and then let you go on. So I work for the University of Chicago, and when we look around where these engines of growth are, like Silicon Valley, for example, one of the things you build on is great educational institutions. And we bring in students from all over the world. I teach them finance. They come and they learn great stuff, and then they go. And they go to New York, they go to London, they go to Singapore, they go to Hong Kong. They don't stay here in Chicago. So we've got one of those crucial ingredients. It's not like being out in the middle of nowhere where there aren't great educational institutions to start the new Silicon Valley. Then you need to have that wellspring, that ferment of lots of little businesses starting and going and not just one or two big things going. Well, that's what we need. Good luck to us to get there.
It's interesting, the comparison between Chinese communists and Chicago Democrats. A bit redundant, but it's interesting comparison. You mentioned education. So one of the things I understand from a Federal Reserve Bank of New York study from a couple years ago, Illinois, and this I think was probably going to come as a shock to people in Chicago and with universities like University of Chicago, Northwestern, University of Illinois, others. Illinois, 46th in the nation in where college graduates choose to live, behind even West Virginia. So what does that say in these times about what Illinois isn't doing and what it should be doing to attract the best and the brightest despite great institutions of higher learning?
Yeah, we have great institutions. We have a gorgeous place to live, and yet it's not the place to go for young people, which isn't just individual businesses. The hard part, especially in financial services, what would it take for Chicago to be the hot spot for financial services? Well, not just one big business like the CME or getting David to come here with some special tax deal to have one business. That doesn't do the trick. What the hot spots have is lots of little companies, so that my students If they get a job in Chicago, well, it's much harder for them to hopscotch to the next job. That's what the exciting place is. You go somewhere, it works for a while, you hopscotch to another job, that network of connections, of new ideas happens. That's not happening here, and it's sad to see. You know, I live in Hyde Park. Lots of students come. Every other university place I go to, you know, Berkeley, Harvard, Stanford, the people come and they never leave. And for us, they come and they leave. That's too bad. Now, the other part is the other part of our educational system. We got great universities. We don't have so great on the other end. Actually, before I went to MIT, I'm actually a graduate of the Chicago Public Schools. And they can do a good job, but they're not doing a good job for so many of our people who really need it. And like David said, you need a good educated labor force at all levels if you're going to start a business. Well, we're failing on that too.
Thank you very much. Ike Brannon. Ike Brannon is the Director of Economic Policy for the American Action Forum. You've recently done some work on capital gains rates on investment income essentially, and at the state level, kind of comparing state to state. I guess my question would be, what are the states that are doing it, or which are the states that are doing it right? And also, how, from a translating ideas into public policy perspective, do you message on capital gains so that you're not getting drowned out by people who just think if you're talking about capital gains tax rates, you're just talking about tax breaks for the rich?
I think it's very difficult to get through. And the point economists always make when you talk about taxes is that the person who's actually writing the check is not the person who's paying the tax. The corporate tax rate is not borne by the corporation. It's not really even borne by the shareholders. It's split between the shareholders, the customers, and the workers. And the last 20 years has been really a sea change in economics. As John can tell you, we just have a lot more data available, and we're able to look at a lot more things in much greater detail than we could when we did our dissertations 20 or 25 years ago. And there's really a consensus that goes across the economic divide that most of the cost of capital taxation is borne by the workers. The more we tax capital, the less investment we have, the less investment companies make, the less productive the workers are, and ultimately it's productivity that determines the wages of a worker. So the state of Illinois can tell everybody, well, look, we have this, we're mandated by the Constitution to have a proportional income tax rate on individuals, so the only way we can make our tax code progressive is to really tax capital gains and make sure we have a high tax on corporations, but that doesn't do anybody any favors at all. It means we're going to have fewer jobs, and the jobs that remain here are going to be less productive. In this research that you alluded to, one of the things we look at is who are the people who are leaving the states of Illinois, Wisconsin, and so on, and where are they going? Well, as Jimmy John is a perfect example of, where they are going is Florida, where there is no capital gains. And so states that are trying to get creative, that are trying to do something about this, like Governor Kasich in Ohio, are targeting capital taxation. How can we make it cheaper to invest in our state? And John, I think, has the great reason for why to do this. We can't rely on a governor to just dollop out tax breaks to favored industries, because we can't figure out what the best industries are, who the biggest employers are going to be in the state 10 or 15 years from now. They're almost certainly not going to be the big companies here. Ultimately, when we start giving out individualized tax breaks, they're done for political and not economic reasons.
Well, I think we will know actually in Chicago who the biggest employers will be, because they're consistent year after year. It's the city of Chicago, it's the Chicago public school system, and it's the county of Cook. And so the interesting word choice of investment, right? Investment seems to be something that there is bipartisan agreement on. Karen Lewis, the president of Chicago Teachers Union, in this running confrontation with the city and the school board, has talked about investing in schools. We hear the term investment used all the time by folks that believe maybe a little bit more in central planning than they do in markets. And so how and why should we distinguish between public sector units that invest in education, in infrastructure, in job creation, and job training programs versus private sector investment?
Well, I mean, the way we would distinguish it, of course, is, that people like Jimmy John, they invest in what's going to be most productive for their company. They are not going to think about political reasons for investments, but the government simply aren't able to do that. They have too many competing interests, and ultimately, the people who decide how Cook County, how the city of Chicago, how the Chicago public schools spend their money, they're not necessarily thinking about how can we make this most productive investment. Rather, it's how can we reward our friends and punish our enemies.
Thank you very much. Brian Wesbury joins us. He's the chief economist for First Trust Advisors in Wheaton. He hails from my hometown, God's country, out there in DuPage. So we're happy to have him. Brian, the issue of unfunded liabilities.
Right.
Maria Pappas, the Cook County Treasurer, did a report maybe a couple months ago that found that the average, the median household in Cook County owes $75,000 in debt to just the the city and county government. So forget the state of Illinois, forget the federal government, just at the city and county level.
Right.
How much do businesses look at the debt burden they're walking into on a per capita basis or a per acre basis before they make a decision as to where to locate, or if where they're located now is a place they want to expand?
Yeah, I think the direct answer to that question is a lot. Especially, I mean, we've heard about it here, the taxes, the small business. John is absolutely right. Where do people start businesses? Where do they stay? Do they move? And it's very clear that in Illinois, over the past 30 years, we've been on a downward spiral. We're in a death spiral, if you will, a vicious downward spiral where you have higher taxes, higher unfunded obligations, which makes a worse place to do business, which attracts fewer people, which attracts fewer businesses, and it keeps heading down. And you can see that. I've put some charts on everyone's seat in the credit default swap spread market. Illinois has this is the cost of buying insurance. We heard about this a lot back in 2008, but the insurance on a bond. If you want to buy a bond and then you want to insure it against default, how much does that cost? This is, if you're a bad driver, you pay more for insurance than a good driver. Illinois has the highest credit default swap spread in the nation. It's above California, and we are approaching levels that Greece and Spain and Italy were just a couple of years ago, to put this in context. What's always interesting about the credit default swap market is that it's ahead of the rating agencies. All right, the rating agencies are always behind. That's my second chart. It's just a map. Illinois is A, California is A minus, but according to the credit default swap market, our A is too high. If California really is an A minus, we should be a B plus these days. But then to get directly, I did some math recently just to kind of make it apparent. If you're thinking about buying a house or moving to Illinois, what is the cost of this unfunded liability? And it's on the very last chart. In Illinois as a whole, on average, per acre, we Illinoisans pay $729 an acre in property taxes. But if you look at that same piece of property per acre, it's got $2,200 or $300 of unfunded liabilities attached to it. You know, if people can leave, but the property can't. So if the property has to support the unfunded liabilities, it's $2,300 per acre. Now, we all know that in the wealthier communities, Cook County, Lake County, DuPage, and there's lots of others, that the property taxes are much higher than they are for the state as a whole. I mean, remember, the state has a lot of farmland, and there's very low property taxes on farmland. Jimmy Johns can tell us about that. You said you liked farming, and so the property taxes are on that farm. But in DuPage County, for example, where I live, the average property tax per acre is $11,800. If you use the same ratios, where I live, $37,980 per acre of unfunded pension fund obligations come with your land per acre. Now, I want to make something clear about this. I looked at my property tax bill this morning. Of my property tax bill, 3% of that goes to fund pensions. So if I take that 3% and compare it to what I calculated per acre, it would take me 98 years of my current pension fund payments every year to pay off my obligation to the pensions. Because remember, property taxes fund schools this year to the tune of 97% of those property taxes. Only 3% goes to the pension funds. So right now, the obligation on my land is 98 times my current annual payment. Now, I'm not saying that businesses sit down and calculate this when they move or think about where their employees are going to live. But what happens is that the burden of those taxes, the burden of those unfunded obligations, the credit rating, the higher cost of borrowing, the higher cost of employees, the higher cost of land, all of that begins to make us less competitive versus other states. We begin to lose businesses. We lose business relative to businesses doing in business in other states. And that's what creates that vicious downward spiral. We are in the middle of it right now. We have to change course, or we will, the whole state will eventually look like Greece does today, or Detroit does today, where it's a vicious downward spiral where you are literally chasing your tail and you cannot get out of it.
98 years, that's not as bad as I thought. That's thank you for striking that optimistic note.
Yeah.
So we have to pull out of this death spiral.
Right.
So what's the first order of business? I mean, in the Sun-Times today and yesterday, there's stories about how people are gaming the workers' comp system to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars, really millions of dollars over the course of their lives. So you've got a workers' comp system that makes us uncompetitive. You've got the largest unfunded public sector pension liability in the country, which makes us uncompetitive. You've got the tax burden, which makes us uncompetitive. You've got the worst credit rating in the nation, which makes us uncompetitive. You know, where do you start? I know politicians say we're going to do everything at the same time, but is that realistic? And if it's not, where do you start?
Yeah, this is where Aaron's here, so we can talk about what the politicians are thinking. But we have to change our pension system. The problem is, because of a 1970 state constitution, it's now in the Constitution. We have to, these pensions are protected by the Constitution of the state of Illinois. I mean, you know, you almost have to change that before you change the pension system, it seems to me, unless, I don't know, unless you get them to go on strike and then fire them. But we're not to the point where we seem to be willing to fix this. And it makes me sad. We're going to lose more business. I think, in a way, I hate to say this, but it almost has to get worse before it gets better. I don't know. I hate to be so. I'm an optimistic person usually, but I think the state of Illinois has such big problems and such knotted political processes that it's almost impossible for us right now to get out of it without a sustained effort over the next 10 to 20 years.
Congressman Aaron Schock joins us, of course. Congressman Schock on the Ways and Means Committee in the House, served in the Illinois General Assembly prior to that. Congressman Schock, when Malcolm Wallop retired, a former U.S. Senator from Wyoming, when he retired in 1994 in advance of the Gingrich Revolution, he had lamented what the Republican Party had become, saying that if congressional Democrats introduce a bill to burn down the Capitol, Republicans would compromise and agree to phase it in over 3 years. I wonder what the feeling is on the Hill now with Republican control of the House and Democrat control of the Senate in terms of the kind of federal policy changes that would be most beneficial to states that have all of the problems that Brian Wesbury just described, like Illinois.
Well, a couple things. First of all, I think the Republican majority of today is not the Republican majority of 1994. And as evidenced by the policies that we're advancing, as evidenced by the type of candidates that are coming forward, without a doubt, the colleagues that I serve with who've been there longer than I've been alive are first to tell me that the Paul Ryan budget that passed the House of Representatives the last 2 years, that bends the cost curve on entitlements, that lays out a framework for tax reform, that got more votes in the House of Representatives than any budget that's passed in the last 20 years under Bush, Clinton, or Obama, obviously, does tough things. And so I think first it speaks to the desire of those who've run for office and the new Republican majority that's in the House. What are those policies? First, you got to have tax reform. The Democrats and the Republicans in the Ways and Means Committee have had 23 hearings over the last year on tax reform. There is broad agreement among Democrats and Republicans on the Ways and Means Committee about what needs to be done. After Dave Camp, the chairman of the committee, laid out our framework, which is basically dropping the corporate rate down to 25%, getting rid of most of the deductions. You got to get rid of about 5 of the 6 big deductions. for corporations, individuals collapsing the top 6 rates, or the 6 rates for individuals down to 2, a 10% rate and a 25% rate, again, having to get rid of most of the deductions. Sandy Levin, who's the ranking Democrat, the top Democrat on the committee, came back and said, we like your proposal. We're not opposed to a territorial tax system, which is something very important to multinational companies. We just think the top rate is going to have to come down closer to 27%, not 25%. In Washington, D.C., that's pretty darn close. Now, I tell you that because that's Republicans and Democrats in Congress. That is not the White House. And where there is huge disconnect right now and a lack of leadership is coming out of the administration. The president's proposal on tax reform does the complete opposite to what we're trying to do to make America more competitive. For example, let me just use multinationals, which are headquartered in my hometown, here in Chicago as well. These are people who make money overseas. Republicans and Democrats on the committee, a majority of them have agreed, we need to move to a territorial system, which is what most industrialized countries have, all the other OECD countries have, which basically says, look, pay the tax in the country you made it, and we'll be glad to let you bring that money back here to the United States to pay out in executive comp, to pay out in shareholder dividend, or to reinvest here in our country. Right now, we have $1.3 trillion in self-identified money of companies who've raised their hands publicly and said, I have cash in an offshore account I will bring back tomorrow if you let me and invest here in the United States of America. Microsoft, for example's CEO met with us and said publicly, I have $40 billion in cash I'll bring back tomorrow and invest here in the United States of America. That's a $1.3 trillion no-cost stimulus bill that we don't have to borrow any money for, we don't have to tax anybody for, we just have to allow it to come back. Republicans and Democrats agree on that. The president's strategy is, he says not only should we not allow that money to come back, we should tax that revenue of a US-based company, whether they ever intend to bring it back to the United States. So basically making any flagged multinational company headquartered in the United States at a significant competitive disadvantage from any other multinational company headquartered in another country. That, to me, would exacerbate the type of flight that we've seen out of the United States. Organizations like Aon that have left Illinois, not for Indiana, but have left for the UK because of the tax structure. You'd see more InBev type purchases of Anheuser-Busch, where it becomes more and more, for a competitive advantage sake, it makes sense to be flagged in another country. So competition internationally for multinational companies, but a simplification of the tax code. We've lined up, we've brought in, as I said, 23 different hearings on tax reform. I've had the CEO of and the CFO of Caterpillar, which is headquartered in my hometown, sit before me and say, look, we love the R&D tax credit. We love the fact that people are buying our equipment because of bonus depreciation. But guess what? We're willing to give it up if you get us to 25%, because we will favor consistency over any type of a slight dip in the marginal rates from time to time. And we've heard it from Microsoft, we've heard it from the pharmaceutical companies. Industries alike say simplification over any short-term sugar high that we might get out of a loophole or a deduction. And that's the stated goal of Republicans and Democrats in Congress. I'm hopeful that under a new administration we can get it done, or perhaps under the second term of this administration it might happen in spite of where the president's at on this, because Republicans and Democrats agree on much of what needs to be done.
I've got a short follow-up and then a little bit longer one. The short follow-up is when you talked about tax reform and how close Republicans and Democrats are, at least in terms of the broad outlines, and you mentioned the deductions. This is a bit of a sticking point. Mitt Romney doesn't want to be specific about it. A lot of people don't want to be specific about it. When you talk about eliminating the big ones, are we talking about the mortgage deduction? Are we talking about the charitable deduction?
Well, I think it gets back to what I was saying about companies, right? Nobody's going to stand here and say, I'm not for the R&D tax credit. I'm certainly not going to say that. Nobody's going to stand here and say we should get rid of the mortgage deduction. I'm not going to suggest that. What I will suggest is if you look at what you pay as an effective tax rate as an American citizen, at some point there's a diminishing return from having different deductions as opposed to having a lower rate. And so if we can get to a point where we can get a lower overall rate, I think it's to everyone's benefit to simplify the tax code from the 70,000 pages that we have to something that you can do with a small booklet. I don't know whether that means putting limitations on certain mortgage deduction. Perhaps some of the other deductions would have limitations as well. That's where anytime you get an elected official who has a purist position, they're being unrealistic. If I stood here and said, look, I will not vote for a tax agreement package that doesn't have X, you're being unrealistic. I realize that I'm going to have to negotiate if Democrats keep the Senate with Max Baucus, who's the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and he and I are not going to see eye to eye on everything. But the fact that we believe there needs to be a territorial system, the fact that we believe we need to get rid of a lot of these deductions for overall simplification, whether we get rid of deductions completely or whether we put limitations on some of them that we believe have an important socioeconomic impact on society, i.e. home ownership or donations to charities, then that's something that will be debated between those who are in power.
A follow up on the multinational corporations and then open this up to the rest of the group because I know you all talk to the executive leadership of Fortune 1000 companies and multinational companies. You mentioned Caterpillar from Peoria, so you speak with them. We're not just losing business in Chicago and Illinois to India, we're losing it to Indiana. And Mitch Daniels probably has a lot to do with that and what they've done, what he's done in Indiana. But in addition to that, when Caterpillar has talked about investing or has gone about making capital investments, despite the fact their world headquarters is in Peoria, it's engine facilities in Arkansas and San Antonio. What are the conversations you're having with the executive leadership of these major employers in states like Illinois in terms of what they say beyond tax reform that make some states more attractive than other states to locate?
Excellent question. Let me give you two real life examples. First, we lost $1 billion of private investment from a international fertilizer manufacturer, a company called Orascom, who was looking at the Midwest to build, or is building, a new fertilizer plant to service its customers. Fertilizer goes to farmers. We're the breadbasket of the nation. It makes sense to be close to your customers. They want to build it in the Midwest. The legislature in Illinois passed and the governor enacted a series of incentives for Orascom that far outweighed any of the other states' offers in terms of tax giveaways, in terms of sweeteners, in terms of aid in construction and infrastructure necessary for the plant. It's a Christmas list about a mile long of what they got. The CEO last 2 weeks made the announcement that he is choosing to put his $1 billion of private equity capital in the state of Iowa. And what he said at that news conference in Iowa ought to send a shiver down every one of our spines that live in Illinois, because he said this: without a doubt, the incentive package offered by the state of Illinois was by far the most lucrative for my company and our shareholders. However, I could not in good conscience make a recommendation to put our $1 billion investment in Illinois because that state and its elected officials have not shown the leadership to put forward a plan for how they're going to deal with their unfunded liabilities and their debt. In other words, what he was saying is he would have come here had there been a plan laid out, had there been a plan enacted that showed how we were going to pay off our $9 billion in bills at the comptroller's office and a way in which we were going to make our pension solvent over the next several decades. Nobody is suggesting that this problem is going to be solved overnight. Nobody is suggesting that you're going to do it exclusively through cuts. I mean, many of my Republican colleagues and friends who live in Illinois, some of may perhaps be in this room, say, look, I'm willing to pay a little bit more. But don't raise my income tax 67% and still have $9 billion of unpaid bills at the Treasury. Don't raise my income tax 67% and not fix the major drivers of our debt. So because of a lack of leadership there, we are losing real live entrepreneurs and investment that could be coming to Illinois but for that. Caterpillar, case in point, what they tell me, and I have many conversations with Doug Oberhelman, their CEO, who's a good friend, is he says, look, well, give you a case in point example. We passed Colombia, Panama, and South Korea, 3 important trade agreements for that company. And as a result, and the high tax rate in Japan, they decided to locate a new manufacturing facility in the United States, primarily to service Latin America, because that's a huge market for them, thanks to those new trade agreements. And I paid a visit to the CEO, and I said, what do we got to do to get the 1,400-person factory to Illinois? And he said, look, Aaron, you could buy the land, you could build the building, you could do everything I need, you could build the road right to it, and give me the keys, but I can't operate it in this state for what I can operate it in about 12 other states. And I met with the team at CAT who did the analysis of all their different plant potential locations around the country. And for example, I know the state of Indiana, their workman's comp to locate in Indiana versus Illinois is 4 times higher for CAT in Illinois than it is in Indiana. Ultimately, they decided to locate that facility in Atlanta, in Georgia, outside of Atlanta, in Georgia. But the point is that it's not just wage rates. You know, some people say, "Oh, gee, we're a union state, so we can't keep jobs." We have a lot of union manufacturing facilities in Illinois that compete internationally. But when you add the layer of workman's comp, which is out of control, you add the layer of one of the most litigious court systems in the nation, tort systems in the nation, and all the other cost thresholds, you make it a state really where it's hard to compete.
Mr. Cochrane, you mentioned earlier this problem that we have of rent-seeking behavior, where companies use the power of the government as a sword or a shield to serve their interests, depending on what issue is at stake. And we saw that with the special deals that were cut for big employers in this state when the the personal and corporate income tax hike were passed. So how do we get leadership from the big employers who make headlines, who the politicians on both sides have to listen to, because nobody wants to be the guy on whose watch Caterpillar or ADM or the CME Group pulled up stakes and moved out of town? How do we get them to show leadership and show the restraint of not going for a special deal, but going for a substantial policy change that would treat all entrepreneurs, all job creators equally?
I hate to be cynical, I don't think it's going to happen. That's not where your leadership is going to come from. I mean, existing big businesses who have made the investment in lobbying and contacts with the government, who know how to get their deals, who know how to get the special treatment, why should they stand up and make trouble for themselves? I think the only hope is for it to come from voters. I think that was David's point. We vote these people in. In the end, the public conversation matters. And I think if people understand that crony capitalism, my colleague Luigi Zingales calls it, that is from both parties, that's what's sucking the system dry, then the rest of us have to insist that that's not what we want.
Mr. Brannon, how do you look at, I should go back again, from the businesses that you speak to, from the executives you speak to, how important are corporate tax rates as compared to some of the other things that have been mentioned here? I give you my example. I know a few years ago in Danville, Illinois was competing for a Honda assembly plant that ultimately we lost, and it went to, I think it was Greensburg, Indiana, another victory for Mitch Daniels. And what I understand from the Danville Chamber of Commerce people is they said, kind of like the story you shared, Representative Schock, it wasn't because of the incentives package. You know what made the decision for us? It was Illinois' Pollution Control Board and how they were going to regulate the operation of our facility on a go-forward basis as compared with the regime and the interface we have with the Indiana state government in this particular area of pollution control. What are some of the stories and some of the takeaways you have from your discussions with corporate executives?
Well, I think one thing that matters a lot, and John alluded to this as well, is what kind of talent you have available. The advantage of starting a company in New York or near Stanford and places like Austin is that there's so much talent there. It's very easy to find new people and it's very easy to attract them. And it's becoming more and more difficult in Chicago and the rest of the state to do that. I'm also from near Peoria, where Aaron is, and the number of college graduates who grew up in Peoria and go back it's minuscule, and it seems like it's shrinking every year. It seems almost an anomaly when you find somebody like that. About 10 years ago, I was a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and we did this study looking at Wisconsin's brain drain. Where are these people going? And Wisconsin's had this problem for some time where their talented graduates simply pack up and move. And what we found is that a lot of them were at the time were going to Chicago and Minneapolis and other places. And a couple years ago, they redid it. I did it for the Wisconsin Policy Research Institute, which is kind of the cousin of the Illinois Policy Institute. And the big difference they found is that those people who are leaving the state of Wisconsin aren't going to Chicago anymore.
Speaking of that, Mr. Wesbury, so we're talking a little bit about education before. Maybe we should revisit it, given the talent, the talent or lack thereof in the labor pool is mission critical from what I'm hearing. So as I understand it, 18 of our 50 most populous cities in this country have high school graduation rates under 50%.
Right.
With Detroit, of course, at the bottom, and Chicago challenging. So what does that say about the importance of radically restructuring K through 12 education? Is that something that should be a priority? Is that something that should be a leading indicator that we're constantly monitoring, as opposed to the stock market or some of the other short-term, day-to-day indicators about how we think we're doing?
You know, I mean, I'm not an expert on education. I'm not even an expert on state finance, but it seems clear to me that when I look around the country, the two biggest areas that we have problems with, and if you want to talk about it, sectors in the economy, are education and healthcare. And those are also the two areas that have the most government involvement. As Milton Friedman would say, the more government involvement we have, the higher the prices and the lower the quality. And it seems to me that that's obvious today. However, once you get down into the nitty-gritty, people are making decisions, as we see with the strike, that are based not on the outcome that we want, educated children that can reach their full potential, but on the selfish issues of my pay, my pension, my work rules, those kinds of things. And by the way, this has been going on, and Amity, your piece in the Tribune today hits this. It's about deals. It's not about the price. It's not about the market. And I want to go back. I mean, you've just reminded me, I didn't come here to talk about this today, but I worked with a guy named Bob Janetsky, who back in the early 1980s at the Harris Bank, we did some of the original work on state taxes and state growth rates. Bob was a pioneer in this area. Sears was a supporter of us. I mean, this was back in the early 80s, and I believe they paid us $50,000 a year to continue this research. All right? They were a free market. Their government affairs office was conservative, free market. Sears was pushing this. They wanted this, and then they wanted to move out of the Sears Tower and to Arlington Heights. The state offered them $130 million. And again, this was a long time ago, would be a much bigger package today. And Bob Janetsky, who was a man of integrity, came out against this, because every dollar that we were going to give Sears was a dollar that other businesses would have to pay, right? I mean, you can't give one company $100 million and not get it from somewhere else. Sears fired us. And not only that, but they called the president of the bank and told him to fire Bob Janetsky. And then the governor called the bank and told him to fire Bob Janetsky. And so what's fascinating about all of this is that this is the deal city that we live in, the deal state that we live in, where it's all about the power of the politics and what they can give out. And even people who believe in free markets will cave when it comes down to getting a $100 million check. And so I believe Sears, for example, and I know I'm where I am, I'm probably going to get struck by Sears bought lightning here any minute, but literally proved themselves to be more interested in their own temporary, short-term bottom line than the actual policies that would create growth in the state of Illinois over a long period of time. And I think you can see it in the strike today. I think you can see it in all the deals that are being cut by the state. We raised taxes, and then we had to give money away to keep people here. I want to stand up and cheer when I hear this guy who walked away and went to Iowa, because that's the right thing to do. It's hard to do the right thing when people are waving a check in front of you and when there's votes at stake. But we need more people that do the right thing. And my vote would be, I don't want to burn down the Capitol in 3 years. I never want to burn it down. But it's hard to get politicians to vote. Instead, they so-called compromise, and we end up with just bad policies that take longer to hurt us.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary on the deal city, the deal state. A great man once said that Illinois isn't broken, it's fixed. That great man, of course, was me. We've got about 13 minutes left, so why don't we take some questions from the audience for the panel. So if you want to raise your hand, a question, not a speech. I've been talking to Chicago Teachers Union reps all week, so I'm loaded for bear. Don't make me come out in the audience. Mm-hmm. Back there.
Hi, I'm Jeff Halm. You talked about rent-seeking behavior at a corporate level, and I'm wondering if you have similar thoughts about rent-seeking on, like, at a private citizen level. You know, you see these people who are strategically defaulting on their mortgages versus the people who are, you know, basically chumps that are continuing to pay their mortgage, and then, you know, they have nothing to show for it. So I'm wondering if you see a similar problem developing in where people are like, well, I might as well, you know, get what's mine because it's hard to do what's right.
Who wants to take that?
I don't know. One thing I've kind of observed, I've written a lot recently about tax reform, and one of the things I've said is that we need to rein in the mortgage interest deduction. I'm not a politician, so I can take a stand. And to me, it seems like this is almost a litmus test for any kind of tax reform. We spend $100 billion, we give up $100 billion a year of tax revenue on the mortgage interest deduction. And it doesn't do anything to increase home ownership at all, right? If you're a typical American making $70,000, $75,000 a year, you do not benefit at all from the mortgage interest deduction. And people can talk about, you know, I have friends who ask me all the time about tax reform, and I tell them, look, this is one of the things that we're going to have to cut back. And then people start getting outraged, right? Especially the people who have big mortgages. What I thought was interesting is I sent, being from Peoria, I sent an article to one of the papers in the Peoria area on the mortgage interest deduction. And one of the things I pointed out is that if you cut the mortgage interest deduction and you cut it down, say, by we're going to cap it at $500,000. I pointed out that in Peoria, in 2011, there were only 13 homes that sold for more than $500,000. So I pointed out in this article that, look, Peoria would not be affected by such a reform. And this is the reform that was proposed, if Eddie Lazier is still here, that Eddie Lazier and those guys proposed in the 2005 Bush reform tax cut. And the papers went published, and they said, look, you're going to anger the realtors who pay for the bulk of our newspaper. I think you're spot on. And I think what you're going to see is when we start talking real about tax reform, everybody wants it, but when we start getting into the particulars, there's going to be some gigantic food fights. And I'm rooting for Aaron, and I'll help him however I can. But thank God I'm not Aaron Schock on the Ways and Means Committee.
If I may, the answer is the grand bargain. I'll give up mine, you give up yours. The mortgage interest deduction should be zero. Now, we could do it on new mortgages. That's better than limiting it by income, which gives you one more disincentive to work and get rich. The old mortgages, you bought your mortgage under that deal, we'll honor it. New mortgages, no interest deduction. It's horribly regressive. It goes to rich people. It doesn't go to poor people. It does nothing to it does nothing to increase home ownership. Let's get rid of the charitable deduction, even for the University of Chicago. We'll do fine. That one is, when you look at a lot of the charities that benefit from it, that's a complete scam. We can just all lower the rates and get rid of all our deductions, all of the tax expenditures. Stop spending money, giving rich people money to buy Tesla Roadsters so that they can drive to their private jets with it. So I would encourage you, Congressman.
State and local deduction?
State, you name it, all of it, zero. That brings the rate down. As an economist, I look at the marginal rate. If I earn an extra dollar, how much of it do I get to keep? That's what gives the health of the economy, not how much taxes do I pay overall. So I know you can't say it in public, but I hope when you get back, the answer is, okay, good. Now, let's start from zero.
Yep. Just to add to the state and local tax deduction, benefits high tax states over low tax states. Or sort of. But the bottom line is that it makes it easier to have a high tax state.
Next question. Where's the microphone? Oh, over here.
Thank you for being here, Congressman. My question is more political. I'm 24 years old, and my generation, it seems like, is going to get kind of hosed with this debt crisis we're facing, and no real economic solution. My question is, how confident are you with our current leadership in Congress that you're going to be able to find an amicable solution to this debt crisis and so many of the other economic woes that are facing our country.
And are you asking about the leadership in the House, the Senate?
Well, obviously, since you being House, in the House, I think, would be where your area of expertise would be.
Okay.
So.
Well, you're right to be concerned. The fact of the matter is the decisions that are being made or aren't being made are going to rest much more in weight on those of your generation and my generation and the generations yet to come than, quite frankly, many of the people I serve with in Washington, D.C. Look, I don't think everybody in Congress should be my age, but I don't think everybody in Congress should be in their 60s and 70s. And if you look at the age demographic in Washington, D.C., when I showed up at 27 years old, I brought the average in the House down to 59. The average in the Senate, we won't go there. But the point is that you look at things differently based on where you are in life. You certainly look at entitlement programs differently when you're on them as opposed to when you're just paying for them. So with regards to my confidence in my leadership in the House, I have great confidence in my leadership in the House. Anybody who's willing to bring forward legislation that has no chance of passage in the Senate, that is demagogue to get out by the president, and willing to put their members' neck on the lines and cast those votes in the affirmative to lay out there in broad daylight what we stand for, I think is leadership to be proud of. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Is the legislation we brought forward going to be what passes in its final form? Probably not. But the fact that we have someone in our leadership team who is willing to do that, we have a speaker, a majority leader, and a whip who's willing to help us implement the legislation, at least through the House, I think speaks well to the possibilities if we get a counter leadership in the Senate and hopefully in the White House. It's frustrating, though. It's frustrating to only have one lever of the ship and one foot, and it's on the brake, and the other one's on the gas pedal, and you're not going anywhere. So it is a very frustrating time right now to be in D.C., but I think what it speaks to, and the question was asked, what do you do to change the direction here in the state? What do you do to change the direction in Washington, D.C.? Elections have consequences. And the fact of the matter is who we elect ultimately determines what kind of state we're going to live in and what kind of country we're going to live in. And we don't have to wonder whether it's possible. I mean, in Illinois, we look around, we look at a state like Indiana and say, gee, look at what Mitch Daniels has done there. It didn't happen overnight. When you look at a state like Wisconsin, I mean, this used to be the Socialist Republic of Wisconsin. They have a Republican House, Senate, and governor. You look at Michigan. I mean, does Michigan really have more to offer than Illinois? We got richer farm ground, transportation hub of the nation, the lakefront of Lake Michigan with the port system, the busiest airport, rail yard. Chicago's a far more vibrant city than Detroit, and yet they've woken up with a Republican House, Senate, and governor, and they're changing things in the state of Michigan. I think it's possible when people get engaged, and I'm excited that the young people of this country, both that are still on the college campus when I visit them, who say to me, you know what, I may be more socially liberal than Mitt Romney, I may be more socially liberal than Republicans in Congress, but by God, the most important thing to me, after busting my butt for 4 years in college and taking on $50,000 in debt, is getting a job. And I spoke recently at Deloitte, downtown Chicago, 200 accountants, and I was there to talk about tax reform at the federal level, and something happened that has never happened. They wanted to talk about state issues because they're busy auditing companies that live in the state of Illinois who are looking at making investments and putting people in other states precisely because of the tax policy. And so there's now beginning a connection between the policies here in the state and even on their own way of life. So I'm encouraged that young people, I think, are waking up to the realities of what's in front of us, the debt burden that's in front of us, and I'm hopeful that this November there's going to be a change.
I'd like to follow up on this, though, because this brings us back to one of the questions we mentioned. And I'll put it to you this way. Are the states too big to fail? Because we know we're heading for a debt crisis in Illinois. The debt that's on the books is small compared to the huge debt that's off the books, all the promises we've made to the retirees. When Illinois can't roll over its bonds, when California can't roll over its bonds, this becomes Greece, will the federal government step in and say, no, you're too big to fail, we're going to bail out the states? I think some of the reasons the credit rating, the CDSs are lower than they should be because a lot of people are betting on there's no way they'll let the states.
I think Draghi's going to buy our debt.
Well, I would say this, the unfortunate things.
But this is the crisis we're not talking about, and that could be the spark that leads to our big debt crisis.
I think the unfortunate thing for states like Illinois and California is that we're not a majority in Congress. And so while the majority in our state can continue to whore itself to different union constituencies and different special interest groups to give away the store, the reality is the rest of the country's not doing that. And the fact of the matter is my colleagues in Washington, D.C. walk up to me and they just shake their head and go, what are you guys doing in Illinois?
Yeah, but
And the sympathy is not going to be there. Look, the legislature made some comments in the last legislature that, well, the Congress will bail us out, to your point. And 11 Republican congressmen, the entire delegation in Illinois, wrote the governor and the legislature a letter, I was a part of it, that said, drop your dream because we're not coming. We're not Santa Claus. We're not going to bail you out. And I don't think there's going to be a majority in Congress that's willing to do it, even if I voted for it, even if all 18 congressmen that are left now from Illinois voted for it, and the ones from California. There are not enough bankrupt states, thankfully, at this point, and there are members of Congress that are willing to go along with bailouts.
But let me press this issue a little bit more, because it's easy to decry the leadership of this state, and follow up on that gentleman's question. Andrew McCarthy at National Review Online takes a little bit more hardline approach, and as much as certainly as the left paints Paul Ryan as this radical, his proposal is to balance the budget in 28 years. His proposal, as Andrew McCarthy calls Romney and Ryan, their proposal is still to be centuries for the welfare state. In a different day and time, the Ryan plan would have been the Democrat plan, and the Republican plan would have been something much more substantial. So, are Republicans willing to, even at the state level, at the federal level, it's not just for Representative Schock, it's for everybody, are Republicans going far enough, even when they propose things that are characterized by the media as radical, like the Ryan plan?
Let me just follow that up with a Illinois. I use Illinois as an example of what will happen to the nation. I mean, we had Governor Thompson, Republican, was in for 4 terms. Edgar was in for 2 terms. Then we elected Ryan, and he served his first term downstate and his second term other place. And was Republican leadership for all of these years. So yes, who we elect matters, but what matters more is what their policies are. And that's, I think, one of the keys that we have to think about.
We got time for one more question, I guess, way in the back there.
Speaking of leadership deficits in Illinois and elections having consequences, I think we pointed out the fact that voters have to hold politicians accountable for their actions. And as much as we're all trying in this room, you come across a We Ask America poll that was released yesterday in the 10th district, where Derek Smith, who has been indicted for taking a $7,000 bribe, was expelled from the House. We Ask America poll released yesterday found that if the election were held today, he would swamp his opponent, 48% to 9%, with 43% undecided. And the pollster found that there was an alarming amount of people who weren't even aware of the charges against him or the fact that he had been expelled, and many others simply just vote along party loyalties. So, granted, the 10th district is not representative of all of Illinois, but are there just some areas that are just impossible to win over? It's not like it didn't get enough press coverage. It was all over the newspapers, all over the news stations. What else can be done to inform voters to get them to hold their lawmakers accountable? It's
not representative, but it's not representative either. The interesting thing, choices, and I'll turn it over to whoever wants to pick. The guy running against the guy running against Derek Smith is Lance Tyson, who is Todd Stroger's former chief of staff. So, I believe that's what they call a Hobson's choice. But anybody else in terms of the choices, I guess it's kind of what you were talking about, Brian, when it comes to, just because you have an R or a D, it's the policy choices that you're going to make. But any other comments on that? I
would just say I think it speaks to the fatal flaw of our system right now, I think, is the way we redistrict. And I'm not suggesting that I have a silver solution to it or gold wand solution, but I think if there's one thing you could fix, it would be putting people in competitive congressional seats, competitive state house and state senate seats, because when you get a district that is overly Republican or overly Democratic, that's when you get the hyper-partisanship, and it's also when you get the lack of accountability to the general electorate, because it allows for the Derek Smiths to get reelected despite the flaws. It allows the Charlie Rangels to come back continuously to the House despite the flaws. that wouldn't happen in a marginal seat. It wouldn't happen in a 50-50 seat. So again, not because I have the solution, but it is the glaring problem I see as an elected official for how people get away with murder.
In some cases, maybe literally.
Competition is good in all things.
Yes. That's going to be the last word. Round of applause for the panel, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Professor Cochrane, and our two fellows, Ike and Brian. And thank you, Congressman. I think we need more 27-year-olds in Congress. No doubt about it. I know. I know you're 31 now. So I love this Chicago energy. So we're going to take a short break. Lunch is downstairs in the beautiful, historic Chicago Stock Exchange room, and that starts at 12:30 on the dot. Okay? We'll see you there. For Mitch Daniels.